Hey YouTube, welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video to Mr. Terry as I continue my search for historical knowledge here on the internet. Alright, today's video I'm going to be checking out is What If the Roman Empire Never Existed by Alternative History Hub. This seems like an obvious important topic for the fact of how influential and important the Roman Empire has been. How many people have, or civilizations have been influenced by it. How many tried to recreate it, basically, which is a lot. And so I thought this, I definitely thought this would be interesting. And I know a lot of you are very into the Roman Empire, so hopefully you'll like joining me here. So if you like the original video, Alternative History Hub does a lot of these alternate history videos, which can be fun. Hypothetical kind of videos. What if something was different than what had happened in the past, and trying to reimagine kind of a world differently that way. So that'd be awesome. But yeah, if you like what we're doing here, love to have you as a sub. Enable those notifications so you can know when my live streams are. Let's go ahead and get started.
This video was sponsored by NordVPN, a virtual private network service that provides much needed security in an age where cybersecurity is more important than ever.
That's cool. That's beautiful. Look at that background. Yeah, what if the Roman Empire never existed? Yikes. So I wonder if that means Rome in the Empire era, so like before Caesar, or just at all Rome, even Republic Rome or Kingdom Rome.
Rome changed everything. Not just because of the political system that they popularized in the West, which still influences us today. Not because their language was the forefather,
Man, I love,
which still influences us today.
I love the Roman mosaic art, where you get the small tiles, small plaster tiles, whatever, and then you paint them. I just think it looks so cool, and of course it has so much utility because you can use it on walls, ceilings, a floor if you wanted to, because it is a hardened thing. I love that style. I think that's maybe artistically the coolest thing that they produced.
Because their language was the forefather to all of these languages, Rome's simple existence, their conquering of Europe, transformed a continent just as much as Europeans conquered the Americas. And this influence began far before Rome called themselves an empire. The Roman Republic made up the entire Italian peninsula. It conquered and assimilated so many cultures just in their neighborhood that we only know about them because the Romans knew them.
Alright, so you gotta ask it every time they do Empire versus Republic. Are you a Roman Republic person, or are you a Roman Empire person? Make your opinions known. Down in the chat or something.
We all like to imagine a Europe where the Roman Empire simply never fell. But after doing some research, seeing how much Rome turned Europe into Europe, I want to imagine a world where Rome never existed at all. This is going to be a journey that alters history more than any other scenario I think I ever did. The Romans existing and spreading into Northern Europe was what changed the European people from simply the inhabitants of a large peninsula next to Asia to a fully fledged, important continent on the world scale. But what it took to get there transformed all of them in the process under Roman sword and steel. Where to even begin in this alternate timeline? Let's set the stage of what Europe was like before there ever was a Roman Republic in the first place.
Greece,
Who are the people, the civilizations and cultures in a pre-Rome world? We'll begin in 400 BC.
Okay.
Most of what we know about Europe north of Italy is either detailed by Greek or Roman historians, archaeology, and plain old speculation. These places were shadowy, mythical lands occupied by a savage people far different than the Mediterraneans. North of Italy were the...
So you can get like throw in the Greek term, the barbaroi, right? Which, like Greeks, for people that didn't speak Greek, they call them the barbaroi, or the non-Greek speaking people, which of course evolves into barbarian, which we use today. But yeah, that's kind of what a lot of these people thought of those inland people. Didn't think of them nearly as civilized. But yeah, that's where that term comes from, the barbaroi from Greece.
regions of Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and Hibernia. The last two simply thought as myths by the Romans until the times of Julius Caesar. The people in these lands were the Celts. Today, when we think of Celtic, we think of Irish, Scottish, or Cornish.
It's not the case. Yeah, no, Celts were all over the place. People only think about them in like the Irish sense or just the Britannia sense, but no, Celts were all over the place. They were very formidable, way more than what I had thought. They were all over the European continent.
A group that has made their name in the islands far north of Europe. However, these places aren't actually the home of the Celtic people.
They're mainly
Ireland and Scotland are more like the last bastion of a people that once controlled most of Europe. But we'll talk more about that later. South of Rome, the Mediterranean was split between three civilizations, with colonies scattered and dividing the region.
Carthage?
The Greeks for centuries had sailed across the sea,
Etruscans,
colonizing
Carthage?
the island of Sicily, Crete, and even southern Italy. In North Africa, the Carthaginians, descendants of Phoenicians from modern-day Lebanon,
say that. Before that, like the Greek colonies, the Phoenicians were the ones who dominated the seas. I guess even during the Greeks, because they built their whole civilization on trade. They just had colonies. They ran themselves as small colonies all around the Mediterranean. They're the carriers of civilization, as we call it in the kind of the history world. And because of so much of their international trade, that is what why they developed the thing they're most famous for, which is the alphabet. Basically, the origination of the alphabet that we use in the West today as an alphabet, which is a writing system based on sounds, is way more convenient and adaptable than a pictographic writing system, where you have to know different character for every word or thing you would want to express. Or an alphabet is just based on sounds, which you can adapt to multiple languages and have a minimal amount of characters. All you really need is a character for every sound a language might make, or just combine sounds too. Or combine letters for sounds too. So that was the biggest thing for the Phoenicians. The Carthaginians were descendants of them.
Created a trading empire that controlled the Western Sea, using people from both Europe and Africa as mercenaries in their wars. To the north,
and where they, you see their big, I'm sure they're going to talk about it, but the big connection with Rome was competing for the islands, Sicily, Corsica, etc. Over here in the Mediterranean, which both were vying for, leading to the Punic Wars, probably the most famous wars the Romans ever had, and Carthaginians ever fought.
People from both Europe and Africa as mercenaries in their wars. To the north of Rome was a culture group known as the Etruscans, or Razna,
the natives,
as they called themselves. The Etruscans didn't have a single state. They were like the Greeks, a civilization of people separated into numerous city-states. We actually know a lot more about the Etruscans because of their proximity to Rome, but we'll talk about them later on. So now that the stage has been set, let's imagine an alternate world where Rome never existed. History, especially ancient history, is a fickle thing. Rome wasn't destined by some divine power to create the largest empire in European history. It was a long, arduous journey of decisions made over generations.
Rome wasn't built in a day, right? That's where that famous saying gets from, because it's totally true.
What I'm really trying to say is there are so many ways Rome could have simply never rose. The brutality of human warfare has really been forgotten in the modern world. Even during the most catastrophic events of the world wars, the cities destroyed were still rebuilt. Hiroshima, Stalingrad, and Dresden were obliterated, and yet today all are populated cities. This is really the outlier in human history. For most of human civilization, there have been many occasions a city is not just simply destroyed, it's annihilated. Its foundations are uprooted. The entire populace is enslaved, raped, and murdered until the only thing left is rubble, and nobody can rebuild. The city of Antioch was once a center of Christendom before the Muslims killed every Christian in the city in 1260. Carthage was once an empire, but the Romans, after 3 wars, wiped it off the map. Troy was thought to be just a simple Greek legend until 20th century discoveries revealed it was indeed a real city in western Anatolia.
Yeah, that
You ever feel like you're being
ended up definitely being a real place. What are they adding me for?
That's
Rome easily
or learn about in college, about Heinrich. How was the archaeologist? The German guy. Anyway, they found it, and they find what was the rubble with it, and they see a ton of charred, like everything was charred, all the foundations, leading credence to the whole it was burned down by the Greeks thing. So yeah, sometimes it can be hard to find. It's amazing. It's always been, and students ask me all the time, is like how do cities just get forgotten? You know what I mean? Like they get destroyed, but you have these places in the world that have been consistently populated for thousands of years, and how could something just like disappear? Because stuff might get destroyed, and then especially the ones that don't get destroyed, that just get abandoned and forgotten. Like how did we not know about the Indus Valley civilization until decades ago? Like they were massive, and we see their small sites all over the place. Place in Western India or modern day Pakistan that has been consistently populated forever. How does something like that just disappear? It's fascinating sometimes.
Easily could have met this fate at some time in its history. In 387 BC, the Gauls sacked the city. It was this attack which spurred Rome to invest in a culture of defense and military prowess. It would never be attacked again. It could be so easy that Rome was simply wiped off the map if the attack was strong enough or savage enough in this alternate scenario. Of course, it simply could have just been an insignificant city on the Italian peninsula, but I wanted to go on that nice little tangent. It is an alternate 400 BC. On the coast of northern Africa, the city of Carthage has already began its expanse across the Mediterranean. The Greeks and Etruscans sustained their own civilizations of city-states. Moving forward 70 years, Alexander the Great still begins his conquest of basically the entire known world at the time. The expanse of both civilizations still happened as normal, since Rome had nothing to do with any of these. The first major change begins around the 200s, when the Roman Republic was supposed to rise and replace the Etruscans. So this new alternate Italy remains the culturally divided mess that it was before the unifying force of Rome. The main dominant power in the region is the previously mentioned Etruscans.
Okay.
So who were these people? The Etruscans and Romans shared very similar history. Hell, even the last Roman kings were Etruscan. And the people would be the most to contribute to this new Roman Republic, even if the Romans looked down on their culture. To the Romans, the Etruscans were what we would call today... They looked down on their northern neighbors as hedonistic, sex-craved, and immoral. A weak neighbor which Rome believed could easily be conquered, and, well, they were. However, even with their lax views of sexuality, the Etruscans still were fine builders and artisans. It's even said many of the contributions we see as Roman were really just adapted from what the Etruscans already had. Many of the builders of the aqueducts and arches were Etruscan. You could say Rome had a great way of copying others after they had already conquered them. Like Disney, but less evil. An Italy with Etruscan influence is split into multiple different states, perhaps never truly banding together, with the Etruscans culturally dominating the north and the southern tip of the peninsula being controlled by the Greek colonists. These colonies were not short-lived either. They existed up until the Roman legions came and effectively kicked the Greeks out. Without Rome, it's very likely the Greeks simply would have stayed and Hellenized the region, making it no different than the other islands they owned, or Western Anatolia. Well, I can't say very likely, because there's always a chance that another power would come and control this area. More specifically, Carthage. The Punic Wars really were the deciding turning point for Western civilization, a battle between who really would influence Europe, even if neither side truly knew the full implications of this. Without Rome to truly beat back the influence of the North African city, Carthage is left completely alone to colonize most of the Western Mediterranean and effectively change the region by themselves.
Because it's almost like would Rome, the Roman Empire, just be the Etruscan Empire and be as powerful as it was? Because they were very powerful, had an economic advantage they would have had if they were basically left uncompetitive in the Mediterranean. So that would totally be a thing, is the Carthaginians become what Rome becomes. Now, how different would that have been than the Roman Empire? I don't know. Maybe it could have been very similar, right? They had a lot of common influences, being, influenced by the Mediterranean world.
Now, this affects so many things, but I'll try to explain them quickly. First, of course, is the starting point for culture in Western Europe. This alternate Europe is now like North America without the colonists. It's left to its own devices and destiny. Carthage takes the mantle as the empire that influences the people of Gaul and Iberia, just not in the way that Rome did. When I mean so much changes since Rome isn't around, I just don't mean in terms of territory. So in this world where Carthage now has free reign to control this portion of Europe, what would they do? They wouldn't conquer and push back the people like the Romans did. If anything, their influence is more subtle. Carthage was a trading empire. They spread colonies far and wide to get more riches from other lands. It was different than the Romans who invaded to defend Rome. Carthage defended its riches. Carthage wouldn't conquer Gaul like the Romans did, but influenced them with trade and connections. Carthage as well was a naval power. They didn't dominate like the infantry of Rome.
So they would be less militaristic than the Romans, which isn't saying much. Romans are among the most militaristic societies that have ever existed. But yeah, it almost seemed like it would be... Because there were benefits to joining the Roman Empire if you were a foreign group, right? They would make deals with places to basically bring them into the empire, all right, under tribute. And one thing the Romans were known was for giving rights to conquered peoples, right? Even citizenship rights, right? But it sounds like with the Carthaginians, people would be influenced to them, not just would become under their influence of their empire, not because of military threat, but because of the obvious incentive of being a part of their trade empire. So I wonder if that means there wouldn't be as many rebellions or really as much cultural influence, because if you would have been probably most likely under more Roman control, more Roman influence if you were under their empire than of the Carthaginians. Based off of that, just the whole idea of being economically successful rather than just something to defend and be focused on that like the Romans were.
Hannibal was the exception, not the norm. Carthage didn't have the tactics of Rome either until Hannibal. But even if they directly mirrored Rome, which is unlikely, the position of their capital would put them in a disadvantage. Imagine trying to control the province of Gaul while being across the sea. Conquering Gaul was a gargantuan task for even the Romans to do, and they were neighbors on land. So be it from their love for money instead of blood, or their incompetence, or simply geography, a Europe dominated by Carthage is ironically a less changed one. There is no great empire to change the continent in its image, and so the native tribes are left to define themselves.
So Europe would be even more diverse, which is amazing now because Europe's incredibly diverse, right? You can see with all the conflict and languages and all that religious differences. So it's hard to almost imagine an even more diverse one, but I guess that would have happened because there wouldn't have been as much cultural influence, so all the different parts of Europe would develop more independent more quickly, right? Because a lot of that diversity that did happen in actual history was after Rome fell, right? And you had the Germanic kingdoms, all, and the whole feudal structure that ends up kind of taking over Europe and getting more individuality that way. And then even with failed attempts at truly continental empires like the Holy Roman Empire later on, it still fails to do that. But I'm definitely following the logic here.
Development is slower over the course of millennia. However, with Carthage, the Celts still have a chance to absorb some civilization, if you will. The coastlines of France, Spain, and Italy might belong to Carthage, but anything more would be too difficult to accomplish and far more costly to matter. This transforms what we view as the West. It isn't simply Europe, but really the Mediterranean Sea as a whole. The sea split
wouldn't be nearly as much separation of southern, the northern part of the Mediterranean, so like modern Europe, and then northern Africa, the southern Mediterranean. It would be far more culturally the same because it's very different now, right? Very different now. A lot has to do, though, with later history, with the Islamic kingdoms, right, that come over in the 8th, 9th centuries across northern Africa, and then, of course, into Spain. That really drove a divide culturally.
Between Carthage and Greece. Tunisia eventually is seen as the homeland to the west like we see the Greeks today, influencing the northern Europeans with a naval fleet and growing numerous colonies scattered across every shore.
But would Tunis have been a intellectual and cultural center like Rome was? Probably not, but maybe to some extent.
Speaking of those people, let's talk about the northern Europeans themselves. Europe at this time really was split into numerous major tribes, like the Native Americans. So who truly were the Celts? When you think of Celtic people today, we think of Ireland, Scotland, and the small pockets in France and Spain.
Sure.
Like I said earlier, though, these were not the Celtic homelands. The Celtic homeland is actually believed to be in southern Germany, and the Celtic people spread out to reach the coasts of Portugal and even central Anatolia, at least before Rome. The Romans had a thing with conquering a territory and changing it into their culture. Today, this is celebrated as bringing the foundations of Europe, and that isn't a negative in any way. It certainly kickstarted the formerly tribal natives into founding their own kingdoms and emulating Rome to compete, but this still came at a high cost.
Do you ever feel like you're being watched? You are. The browser you're using is allowing your behavior to be exploited and monitored. Some websites allow over
Cost. So let's talk about southern Gaul at the time of Julius Caesar in our own timeline in 58
It'd be very
BC.
different.
The Gauls in the south began giving into Roman customs, eventually establishing more orderly territory, producing wine and consuming it. They cut their hair and began to dress more like Mediterraneans than their northern cousins, or the long-haired Gauls. The long-haired Gauls were called so because they were not so receptive to the Romans and their lands, and were far enough away they would be very difficult to influence. In fact, when they began to believe the Romans were overstepping their boundaries and preparing to annex their people, they rebelled. This began what was known as the Gallic Wars, which is overly complicated and doesn't need to be explained. By the end of their rebellion against Roman expansion, a third of all Celts were killed, another third were sold into slavery, leaving only another third in their place.
Big what if there. Gaul would have been a massively important state, right? Because they were powerful, and took a long time. Took Caesar, but it took a long time for them to get incorporated into Rome, the Roman Republic. But that would be like the most power. That would probably be the most powerful state in Europe if the Roman Empire had existed, because the Carthaginians would not have been able to influence that far. But with how powerful Gaul already was, that would be an incredibly powerful state, no doubt. Be no France, right? It would just be Gaul or something.
These wars and the encroachment and assimilation by the Romans were not unlike the natives in America. The culture was pushed back, its people killed, in what was effectively a genocide, until the last bastion of Celtic culture left was on Ireland and Scotland, which just so happened to be past the Roman borders.
Yeah,
After
never
this
got
genocide happened, the German migration began, fleeing another enemy in the east. And it was this German invasion/migration that ultimately led to Rome itself being destroyed and the demographics of Central and Western Europe being changed forever. But what if there was no Rome to weaken the Celts and Gauls? Since Carthage is the one interacting and trading with the Celts in a way could still be influenced by a civilized culture, but it'd be slower, less militaristic, and less prominent. So these Celtic cultures might still remain themselves, just with a Carthage flair. These lands we see as Romance or Latin instead are much more like Ireland or Scotland. They wouldn't be a single nation, but I could imagine there'd be a closer tie compared to the mix-up of Latin and Celtic speakers in our own timeline. In terms of religion, well, a lot changes, but I'll get into that in the...
Yeah. What do you do with the whole Christianity thing? It rising up, it doesn't exist. Maybe it never even branches out from Judaism in general. Very different that way, right? You would just have a bunch of pagan worship, right? Polytheistic, probably, religions.
The next video. The Celts might not stay in their territory forever. The Germans were going to invade south no matter what, simply because of the Huns. Yet without such a weakened state, it could be imagined the Celts would hold on better than the Romans did.
Is that his hair or a mustache? Like his head hair? either way. Interesting artistic representation there.
And so by Rome expanding north and interacting with these tribal people, peacefully and not, they exchanged ideas that they had gotten from the Greeks, and the Greeks got from Crete, and Crete got from Egypt. Yet without that militaristic force going so far north into the forests of Gaul or Germania or Britain and establishing colonies, the foundation of basic kingdoms and things we associate with medieval Northern Europe would never have taken place.
Because there'd be no... Okay, so Rome falls, feudalism develops because of the lack of a continental protection, I guess. After Rome falls, you don't get the feudal structure, so you don't get a lot of those monarchs. You don't get the culture that came with feudalism, right? The whole knights and lords and all that stuff. At least to the extent that we did see, actually, in real life. So that's interesting. Socially, what would happen is something the most famous thing that came out of Europe in the Middle Ages. The whole feudal structure is totally gone. So society completely different.
Instead, these lands might have remained much like sub-Saharan Africa in a way, primarily tribal and rural, with a few distinct tribes being influenced by faraway kingdoms and adopting customs from them.
Yeah, and the whole city idea really kind of starts with Rome too, and the highly urbanized population centers. And the reason they were able to do that was being able to manage resources at a higher level than almost anybody in the world. For example, getting in fresh water through aqueducts, right? Allowed cities to just literally house a population much bigger than anyone else. So yeah, it'd be far more like a frontier than anything else. No big cities probably. No, the only big cities out there would be probably biggest cities would be coastal trading cities.
However, I will talk more in detail about this in part 2. And yes, there will be a second part. The scenario so long I had to split it up, otherwise it'd be a 40-minute video. In the next video we'll focus on the Greek world, Eastern Europe, and the very existence of the Abrahamic religions themselves. So stay tuned for that. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub. Rome was never able to secure their borders, but you can secure yourself. That's why this video was sponsored by NordVPN. A VPN is a virtual private network. Basically what NordVPN does is it secures your information whenever you go online. By accessing a private network with military-grade encryption, you can protect yourself. They have thousands of servers from 60 countries that you can access, and with a simple interface, it's easy to set up. Say I want to have a new address from Britain, well, I can do that. Or India. NordVPN allows you to do that. And it works on any iOS or Android phones and Windows or Mac for computer. NordVPN is offering my viewers 66% off a 2-year plan. That's about $3.99 a month. Just go to nordvpn.com/althist or click the link in the description to sign up and start protecting yourself. That's nordvpn.com/althist and use the code althist at checkout and get started today. I'm sure I've talked about it before, but this truly is an important service, and I recommend that you get it.
All right. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I'm following along. I had not, before seeing this title, had not think about the impact on the Celts before, because they almost get erased from history. I mean, they really do. And totally change what people thought about it. Because very, very few people understand that the Celts were a mainland European people first, and you really only think of them as a very distant ancestor, maybe in the called Britannia, especially Ireland. But seeing theirs, how they probably then would have emerged as the dominant power in mainland Europe, especially Northern Europe, as just kind of the way, the style of Carthaginian culture would not have been one necessarily on inland conquest, right? Overland conquest, as they were a trading empire. So what that would have done with the Celts being kind of the main players in Northern Europe, that was good to think. And the power of Gaul, what that would have been like, is probably the most powerful kind of nation, I guess, Celtic nation, I guess you'd say. That would definitely be possible. So a video 2 would definitely talk, it's got to talk about, like, yeah, the effect of Christianity. I mean, it depends on how far they want to take that, because of Rome's role, obviously, in the spread of it, as Christianity started within the Roman Empire. So, yeah, I'd be interested to see a little bit more of that. Let me know if you'd like to see the part 2 on this. If there's something I should fast track into continue on with this whole Roman Empire never existing thing. If that's something I should fast track or kind of move on to other things, come back to this maybe at another time. But also, go ahead and if you'd like to make some predictions too about stuff that you think would have changed, major things that would have changed if Rome had never existed, stuff that maybe would happen that they haven't talked about yet, like effects on Christianity, effects on future kingdoms, cultural implications. If there's things you think, then share them down, get some discussions. You can do that in the YouTube channel, the YouTube comments. If you have not joined our Discord server, definitely join that. We have over 4,000 people at this time, and of people, and the Rome channel on my server is one of the most popular ones and one of the most well discussed ones. So that could be a good topic of conversation. Alternate history if Roman Empire had not existed. So definitely love to have you as someone to join that. If you like this channel and the whole alternate history thing, whether you're sub to them or not, please go down my description and click on the link so we can get them a like their video, get them views, and sub to them if you're into that. Makes for some fun discussions that way. Love to have you as a sub as well. One way you can also support the channel is to join the Patreon. Starting at simply $1 a month membership, the lowest I can set it there. You can support the channel at its lowest tier, which at the very least gets you access to polls that I put up. I put a poll up about once a week to fast track a certain video, so you get a little more influence there. And also you can get Discord benefits if you join as well. So that's just another way to join. But thank you so much for simply just being here and watching and being part of my journey to become a better teacher and share what I can along the way. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and end here. We'll see you soon. Bye.